You're watching Experience Comic Culture and Sales. Streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
What's up, the internet? It's producer Kyle. How's it going? Hey to everybody in the comments. Hey to everybody over on Instagram. ASM129. Steven Spock. We're going to start off, and I'm going to kind of set up the topic in maybe a way that isn't going to make the most sense right now. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the process by which you audition to be on Saturday Night Live. You have to come to your audition with 2 sketch ideas that you have to present and act out, but then you have to have an impression. And sometimes you get great impressionists, right? You get an Andy Samberg or a Bill Hader or one of these people that does really good impressions. Dana Carvey. And then you get people like Will Ferrell, who aren't really impressionists. They're comedic actors whose impression is, I'm a guy eating a Big Mac and choking to death without making a sound. They have these really weird impressions. And then you have other people who have learned to mimic favorite actors, which is kind of what I can do. When my throat is good, I can do some impressions of famous actors. Including our thumbnail, what's the deal with all these homage covers? Like, not a good impression, but it's an impression. And it got, and as we think about homage covers, some of them are good impressions, and some of them are bad. Some of them are Dana Carvey or somebody like Rich Little, and others are Carrot Top. Is there too many homage covers? Are there too many impressions of, like, everybody seems to have a Trump impression or a Biden impression, or everybody seems to impersonate politicians, right? But like, is the same true as of homages? Are there too many? Are there some that are good and some that aren't? What's the deal with all these homage covers? This is Devil's Advocates.
Hey, Internet. How's it going? Christopher, a.k.a. the Bronze Age Nerd here. Kyle was drinking, so I figured I'd take over.
I'm still getting over the little sinusy thing I had happening last week.
For sure.
And then I spent the weekend outside. And it was like bone-breakingly cold.
Oh, really? Okay. It's been pretty warm over here.
No, it snowed on Saturday.
Whoa, Midwest style's weird.
It was
bad.
Here
it's like grass pollen season, so I got that all going on if I sound a little nasally.
Well, and then today it was 70.
Yeah.
Snowed on Saturday, today it was 70. So like, I'm, feeling it, and so I'm like overhydrating almost. So
for sure. No, that's good. Stay hydrated, everybody. That's a really good tip. It's one thing I learned about being on YouTube, especially on live shows. You should probably drink more water. Speaking of more, and whether or not more is better, the topic of the show tonight, like we discussed, not a sponsor.
But if you want to, Smart Water.
Oh, cue the dad joke of it's not working for me when I drink it. So yeah, speaking about too much of something, that's kind of what we wanted to talk about tonight. Are there too many homage covers? And then before we even get to that point, what's the deal with homage covers? Just like the much more excellent Jerry Seinfeld impression from Kyle.
What's the deal with man hands?
It's crazy, Jerry. It's crazy. That's just a bad George and Kramer mashup. So when it comes to homage covers, there is a little bit of a thing I want to talk about in the beginning, which is the idea of homage covers and just how complicated they could be And I guarantee you it's going to it's going to seem like I'm overthinking this here in the beginning segment a little bit, because I'm going to kind of deep dive a little bit on one particular homage covers. But I really just want to point out, there's a lot of them. I mean, I've seen a million ASM 300s, Hulk 340, TMNT #1, Todd McFarlane Spider-Man #1. In fact, a lot of Todd McFarlane really is kind of the weird trend there. But there's just so many that we see over and over again. And I think there's a massive... Go ahead.
And if you look at a Dynamite release, most of their books have at least 1 or 2 homage covers.
True.
Even if they're just homaging their past covers.
Yeah. Yeah, like they did a whole slew of TMNT 1 covers for across all the main Dynamite lines not that long ago, for example. But yeah, it's one of those things where there's just an absolute proliferation of them. And I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the massive number of variant covers. And we've talked about that before. So this is kind of a little bit of a more zoomed in look at one aspect of variant covers and kind of exploring that phenomenon. The one that to me is always an interesting case study, because I got it wrong. I got it wrong big time. There's a very famous cover out there, and I'll tell you the one that a lot of people think of first. And that's Crisis on Infinite Earths #7, which is the death of Supergirl, classic cover right there, right? I think we can all picture that in our heads. And at one point, I called another cover an homage to that in one of my videos. I can't even remember which one now. And tons of comments started pouring in like, well, I mean, really, that's an homage to the X-Men cover, the John Byrne X-Men cover that comes before that in 136. And that's the Cyclops holding Phoenix cover, right? And that's interesting because I didn't really think about that, even though I'm a huge X-Men fan. Yeah, that came out a few years prior. That cover to Infinite Crisis 7 is so iconic that it's just been emblazoned on the memory.
And I think that's an homage.
Correct. And that is where the rabbit hole begins. And folks, we are about to fall into it.
Is the X-Men cover an homage to a Joe Kubert war story where a soldier is carrying his buddy?
That is the interesting part about it. So that's the earliest one you can remember?
No, that's just an image I can see in my head.
Okay.
I think even that might not be a first. I think even that might be a not a Carmine Infantino, a Shelley Moldoff homage.
Very good. Yep, you're about 4 levels deep on how far back that I can trace this one. Although you can go back much further, especially if you're a comic historian, which I'm not. There's some research I've done on this in the past when this all came up, because like I said, viewers were pointing out that, oh, hey, that's an homage to this cover. But then an interesting happened when I replied to that comment is people, much like Kyle's doing right now, came in and started pointing out, hey, there's other older covers that this is an homage to. And it is, to me, just one of the more interesting case studies. So real fast, Jay, if you could pull up a site I sent earlier. I think a picture's worth 1,000 words, so people know what we're talking about here when we're talking about this particular phenomenon. So it starts out with this, this fantastic classic Jim Starlin cover here for the Death of Captain Marvel, a Marvel graphic novel, which, if this is where the real fun begins here, because that's a very faithful representation of the statue Pieta by Michelangelo, which, it's a very classic statue. If you want to look it up, it's very iconic in its own way in the world of art. And with Captain Marvel sitting on Death's lap there, laying in his lap, that is very much an homage to that particular image. But really, we're talking about this final crisis. It goes so much deeper. So let's scroll down a little bit more, and let's start to look at some of these covers. Here's a great one. This Batman 156 cover. This is the Sheldon Moldoff cover that Kyle mentioned earlier. Okay, now the purists will argue, he's not in his lap, but he does have that carrying, a limp body. That's the main theme. Some people will say it has to be in the lap to be a Pieta pose. Other people just assume anything where you're holding a limp body is the Pieta pose. If you want to scroll down a little bit further, we'll get to some of the other ones that Kyle mentioned, and we'll go a little bit further down the rabbit hole. We won't do this all night. Here, of course, is the Crisis on Infinite Earths, number 7. This is the one that I was talking about in the beginning. It's a classic, absolutely. And we can scroll down a little bit more. Here's the X-Men 136, the John Byrne cover. You can really see the through line here now. As you're a fan of one of these comic books and you saw the other one, you'd think it's an homage to it. Let's scroll down a little bit more. Well, this is the funny thing is a lot of people say, oh, George Perez, that was his homage to that cover, right? Well, actually, George Perez drew other covers in Tales of Teen Titans before that Infinite Crisis 7 cover that are the same pose. In fact, he drew 2 of them 2 years before that. This is one of them, and the other one's right below this. And this is in one of those like specials that gets released, So you have 2 Pieta Pose covers that came out before that. So let's go down. There's a Our Army at War Joe Kubert cover, which is the one that Kyle was talking about. This is the one that often gets cited. This came out in 1966.
That's not even the one I was remembering.
Oh, really?
No.
That's great. That's great. So let's go down. There's actually a Catman Comics one, which is what I want to get to. It's Catman Comics 31. There we go. This is L.B. Cole in 1946, folks. And I'll be frank with you. I've seen platinum age examples before. I can't pull what they are off the top of my head, like in comic strips, that kind of thing that have been referenced as being possibly earlier than this. So for the visual aid, go ahead.
I think there's a Detective Dan Dunn from the late 1930s.
That sounds familiar.
That has one, but for the life of me, I couldn't even begin to look it up because I just don't have a strong enough remembrance of what it is.
And in fact, I mean, we can just kind of quickly go through the rest of these because there's a ton of other images on here just to give you an idea of how many times this has been homaged. It'll go through some of the older ones, and then it'll get to some of the more modern ones at the very bottom that were probably, very familiar. Of course, the classic Green Lantern, Green Arrow. I think that's a really popular one. I mean, there's a couple Lois Lane covers within a year of each other that came out that are the classic pose. I mean, obviously, look at Infinite Crisis 7, and boy, if anything, that's
Superman always seems to be holding somebody like that.
There you go, Batman Sergeant Rock.
I have that book I actually just picked up a new copy of that book.
Oh, right on. That's a good one to have. Yeah.
Yep. Picked up a real nice copy.
There we go. So yeah, there's a lot of these. And then I think that's, you kind of get the idea. We can probably
it's real hard to draw legs good when you're holding people and when you're working with this pose, man.
Although I will say that if you ever wanted an argument for the Liefeld feet thing, which became relevant again today because of a certain trailer that dropped.
Don't talk about it. I haven't seen it. I'm not going to say it. I'm going to stop.
I'm talking about, you don't have no idea what I'm talking about.
Avoid it.
But anyways, drawing feet, it's been done for years and years and years, folks. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the idea, right? This is a cover, a type of cover that has been homaged for literally close to 100 years, decades and decades and decades, right? And so when we talk about homages, I tend to associate that with the modern era because there's a lot of them in the modern era, but it's not a modern thing. Cover swiping is a thing that's been around for a long time. Now we tend to call them homages, but back in the day, they'd call it a swipe usually. And it's something that we'll get into a little bit later on about swiping versus homages and some of the intention behind it. But just as the phenomenon itself, there are tons and tons and tons and tons of examples of this throughout the history of comics. I got to ask, Kyle.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. I was going to ask you, but go ahead. You go first.
When you look at all of those books we just looked at, all of the Pieta poses,
mm-hmm.
How many of them would you consider homage to them? And how many of them would you consider artists using a well-known pose from a very famous classical work as their inspiration? right? Like,
Yeah.
because when I talk about a cover homage, I talk about somebody trying to make a cover that looks as much like the Crisis cover as possible.
Yeah.
Not trying to make it look like Pieta.
Yeah.
Right? But some of those were clearly trying to make the cover look like Pieta.
Right. Death of Captain Marvel to me is the dead ringer, right? No pun intended, although totally pun intended.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is that, it's that kneeling on the lap kind of pose, which is very much the Pieta statue by Michelangelo. So that to me, and there's a few others like that, by the way, throughout time. That to me is clearly Jim Starlin referencing the Pieta pose. The folds in the robe on Death. I mean, it's just, like Kyle's talking about when he's trying to think of an homage to Crisis 7, thinking about the posing and the way the head's tilted and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of what I associate with like a very true homage. Whereas to me, I don't think many artists are really drawing upon the Pieta statue themselves. However, I think when you go back to some of the earliest ones we saw, it's possible that they are, right? Like the Catman comics. Maybe they were just thinking of that from art school or just from, a historical sculpture that many people are aware of.
Well, and the reason I ask is this, is that there are a lot of people that have done homages to the creation of man, right? The Sistine Chapel, right? That whole thing. So that's something that a lot of art students are forced to study. Right. And so it becomes understanding why a piece like that is considered a classic becomes a part of your skill set. The same way that, like, when I went to graphic design school, we learned about the wisdom and the genius of the FedEx logo. We learned about things like why the Coca-Cola logo works the way it does and why Pepsi's constantly changing theirs. These kind of ideas, and that becomes ingrained in your skill set.
Yeah.
Right. So at what point do artists stop paying tribute to classic works and start homaging more modern homages? Right.
Right. And I think it's a salient question. I think it's an extremely hard line to draw. But I do think that the vast majority of modern artists are homaging previous covers. That's just my take on it. When you get to some of those artists from, the Golden Age and the Silver Age, it's harder for me to say because I just feel like this is totally my own take on it. No, just a layman's
opinion. It was harder
opinion.
to see what other people were doing back then.
It was harder to see what other people were doing, and I feel like there was more classical influences in art. And that is not to besmirch any artist today, that a lot of them do have classical influences and they know about a lot of art theory, but there's a tendency to skew modern. It feels like with modern art. I mentioned McFarlane earlier. So many homages these days are McFarlane homages, things like that. So you see that kind of repetition. And I don't think that anybody we're probably going to end up being wrong about this. I don't think anybody that's homaging McFarlane, I don't think McFarlane was drawing on much classical influence. And maybe I'd be proven wrong about that, but that's what it feels like.
Right. Todd's not looking at, Madonna with Child and saying, I'm going to put that on a Spawn cover.
Yeah, it'd be great though for maybe somebody would be able to provide some evidence of sometimes he has actually swiped some classical pieces. But by the way, the quick thing I want to say about this topic that always, a lot of people know this, it's just one of those ones that's fun to me, is ASM 300 to me is probably the most homaged cover, at least in the modern era. And the funny thing about it is that's not even the original cover, even by Tom McFarlane. That's that pose that goes in an issue of Hulk too. That's the funniest part about that to me. I think it's 344, I'd want to say. And it is just one of those fun little facts that's the first time you see like the Hulk kind of doing that pose, going through a circle in the middle of the cover. And that was McFarlane too. So he's really homaging himself in one of the most homaged covers of all time.
Well, and that's another question, right? Like that we kind of have to answer when we talk about these homages, is this idea that there are no new ideas.
Right.
Todd saw Porky Pig come through the end of the come through the circle at the end of a Looney Tunes cartoon and go, "That's all, folks," and decided, well, what if I do that with the Hulk? And people liked it. So then it's, what do I do that with the Spider-Man?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it wasn't a new idea. He just did it his way. And so, is it really an homage if you're homaging yourself? Or is it you're ripping yourself off? Or if you're Todd McFarlane, are you a one-trick pony?
Well, I definitely wouldn't say he's a
Or
one-trick pony.
Rob Liefeld.
Yeah, Liefeld could be a better example, but with McFarlane, I mean, that's the thing is, 3 of his covers off the top of my head are the most homage of all times, and they are different.
Was he a one-trick pony at that time?
Right.
Like,
I get what you're saying.
And as I could tell you this, and you could see it sometimes if you look at the thumbnails for the experience and stuff that I'm doing. It's really easy to get into a routine with doing a certain style of things and turn yourself into that. So I'm not saying that in a disparaging way in the way it comes out. It's really one of those, God, that looks good, but I could do better. Let me do another version of it and make it even better. Let me do another version and make it even better. And usually that happens. So,
well, and that's the other part of this that I think people need to realize too, both when it comes to the phenomenon we're talking about right now, which is an artist repeating their own work, and also with plagiarism or accusations of plagiarism. Sometimes there is a thing that happens where, like, look, I've had this happen to me in my adult life now as a 40-plus-year-old person on this planet. I have an idea, go to start on something, and realize this is not the first time I've had that idea. I've already started a project or something that was along similar lines that I find a copy of, like, on my computer, or, I go to start doing something in real life and realize, oh yeah, I clearly already started this at one point, like organizing this, box of action figures or whatever it is. Right.
Right.
And that can happen in real life with artists too, is they, I'm not saying this is the case, but McFarlane could do a cover now that's similar to one of his old, well, he probably wouldn't do a cover now that's similar to one of his old poses unless it was entirely on purpose, but he could have at the end of his main stint of his career and completely accidentally just recreated an idea that he had before, because it's an idea that he clearly liked and that clearly worked, and it probably stuck with him. That happens all the time, I think, with artists.
Uh-huh.
And it happens all the time to writers too, by the way. You'll catch writers using phrases over and over and over and over again. And that's just kind of like a keystone behavior that it's like filler words that we all have that we say over and over again too.
Right. And so we need to go to our first break, but I just real quick want to acknowledge what Preston is saying. There's more than one Mona Lisa. It's true, but he painted over most of them with other things, so it's not like they're out there. But yeah, maybe he was trying to improve. And there are a ton of, if you go into the history of classical art, artists who were constantly remaking the same piece over and over again because they were unhappy with it. And a lot of that comes from that artist's mental illness. But at the same time, you also have a number of people who are famous for having slashed canvases because they refused to, put out something that wasn't absolutely perfect. So there's this weird kind of thing in terms of classical art like that. And I think that goes into this idea of homaging in a big way, because sometimes it is, God, I'm just not happy with the way that came out. Or, hey, I see what my friend did. I could do that better. Let me redo it and show you.
Yeah.
So we're going to take our first break. But before we do, I want to let you guys know about something. Saturday at 4:30, Fat Jack's Comic Crypt officially moves to Saturday. So one of our longer running shows, they've been on Sundays really since their inception. Fat Jack's Comic Crypt is moving to Saturdays at 4:30 Eastern. So if you're around and you want to shop one of the oldest continually operating direct market comic stores in the country, that's Fat Jack's Comic Crypt, Saturday at 4:30. So we are going to get into homage covers, cover swipes, cover theft of intellectual property, and all of these kind of things in the next segment. But before we do that, listen to these commercials. And if somebody whose voice sounds vaguely like mine tells you to like and subscribe, maybe do it. What do you call the place on Spider-Man's wrists where the webs come out? His website. I hate myself for writing that joke, but you'd make me feel so much better if you just visited our website. We have links to our merch, new release lists, all the show info, and so much more. TheEXPLive.com. Did you know that Arthur, King of the Britons in Monty Python and the Holy Grail was played by a famous Graham? Check out another famous Graham by following our Instagram. In a world where you hit like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, that'd be really great. Thanks. Did you do it like I asked you?
Ring the bell, all that fun
Do you
stuff.
have any idea how hard it is to time out that bell sound?
It's hard.
Not, but I'd like you to think it is for the purposes of clicking it.
I'm pretending right now. It's hard, man. It's hard.
It's not nearly as hard as when you see the ad for the app, making that phone have the app on it as the phone slowly zooms out and moves. That was a much harder piece of editing.
Fun in editing. Hey, by the way, speaking of things, before we get into stuff here, I just want to say, sorry I wasn't acknowledging chat at all. For some reason, I wasn't on the right tab, and I was just not seeing your messages. My bad. I would have acknowledged chat a lot more if I had been on the correct place. So my apologies, chat.
Yeah, no, it's I've been here, and I want to acknowledge a few folks over in Instagram land. For those of you who don't know, if you're commenting on Instagram, it doesn't populate with all the other comments from Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. So we always have to have Instagram open. So we don't always get to it as fast as we would like. But I wanted to acknowledge Manda Panda, who is actually someone who's just here to troll me, which is okay. I will make it up to them by having their cats like me more than them. But they say Midwest weather is going to try to kill you. And then ASM 129 is over there. When we ask the question about homage covers, they say, I love ASM 129 homage covers because their username is ASM 129. There are a little too many nowadays, and very rarely are they $5 normal comic price. They're expensive variants or like DYP running around $50 to $200. They tug at our strings and our heartstrings and our wallets. Fair.
Yeah, definitely part of that sentiment we'll be getting into here soon.
So, I want to kind of get into why homages. Like the question of what's the deal with homages is a good question. But I think in order to answer it, we have to understand why they're making so many.
Yeah.
And why does it even matter? And so I want to start here, and we'll kind of come around to it in a bunch of different ways. But the big reason there are so many, and I want everybody to 100% cop to this, is because we all buy them. Right? Like, we might complain about homage covers, but like also we be shopping, right? And buying them. And if we didn't buy them, they wouldn't make them, which is a pretty simple concept. But are there, and Bronze, you tell me, in chat, you tell me down here. I am speaking for myself, Michael, and unfortunately, I'm speaking for a huge section of this community. So if you're one of the 1% that don't buy them, congratulations, man, but not helping us here. Because they really are being bought in big number. So is there, and I think I know the answer from ASM 129 over on Instagram. Is there a cover that if you see is an homage to a certain cover, you pick it up? Like, I am a big, I'm a big TMNT guy. So when I see something that is an homage to one of my TMNT covers that I love, I pick it up. Is there one for you that, like, if you see it, you're like, gotta have it?
Yeah, well, and I was just gonna say before I even answer that question, just to mention the homage cover thing. I am guilty of it. Now I've kind of consciously rallied against it over the last few years, but I'm looking at my app that I track my purchases on. The second to last comic I bought was an homage. It was a feral homage to Dawn of the Dead. So I'm guilty of it. For me, the one that I'll always go after, you don't see a lot of them. G.I. Joe 1, I would be a sucker for. And because of the deep dive that I've done in the past, and I've kind of resurfaced earlier in the show on the Pieta Pose stuff, I tend to be a sucker for the Final Crisis, or for the Infinite Crisis 7, X-Men, whatever cover version you want to choose. I tend to be a sucker for that as well.
Yeah, for me, it's I collect Kirby homages. So if it's an homage of a Jack Kirby cover, which is something that's happening a bunch.
Yeah.
And the thing I really collect is one of my other big collections is vintage advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly propaganda. And so when I see a cover like the one that you just talked about, right? The feral Dawn of the Dead cover. When I see what was it? They did Flash cover that was an homage to South by Southwest or North by Northwest.
Yeah.
When they do movie poster variant or homages, advertising homages, I love those. In fact, that's what got me into the book Sex Criminals. They did an homage. I was already in the book, but then I started collecting the pink polybag variants because they did an homage to Super Nintendo advertising on one of them. 8-bit.
Those were the not safe for work ones, right? The pink polybags. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So and that got me down a rabbit hole on those.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's an interesting thing, right? Like, you might say you don't chase them, but there are certainly ones that you're not chasing that you're picking up because you're like, oh, I get the joke. I like that cover best, right? Like, is there one? Is there not? Like, that's the question.
And for me now, it's like a really creative take on a cover, or one that it plays on the metaphor or the symbolism of which character is being replaced. That can really turn the tide for me out because it's creative, it's different. It's an homage to something that we don't see very often or haven't seen before in our memory. That kind of stuff will still get me. For me, an ASM 300 homage is probably going to be one of the last covers I'll pick up because I've seen it 1,000 times.
Right. It's ASM 129 over on Instagram says it's ASM 129, but also ASM 50, Spider-Man No More with the spider suit in the trash can. That's inside art that has been homaged as cover art a bunch.
Yeah.
That's a great example. They also say Mike Zeck Punisher 1, Hulk 337, and Wolverine 1.
The Planet Comics, Dave Stevens, there's been a ton of homages to that that I think are that's probably the real answer. I'm a sucker for those. Chad has a lot of great, and in our normal feed has a lot of great ones too that they're talking about. The Jim Lee Batman / Superman pose, the Hush cover. I think is what they're probably talking about, is my guess. Because there's a lot of
feral talk.
Yeah, a lot of feral. That had a lot of great ones. Tony Fleece and Trish Forstner, they turn out some good ones for sure in their series. They're definitely fun.
Right. And CJ, we're not necessarily suggesting that you should pay more for them or that people are. What we're asking is there an homage that you're every time you're going to grab? And for you, it sounds like horror covers, so long as you're getting a price that you feel is reasonable and fair.
Yeah.
And right, I'm not going to go buy a classic advertising homage and pay 10 times cover unless it's something I desperately want. So
the problem is, you do see a lot of these like convention exclusives that are like foil homages or reprints or something like that, and they don't have to be foil, but then they charge like a huge premium on those. And that's kind of a subset of a different problem, I think, in its own anyway. But homages do definitely get tied up into it for sure.
right. So at what point, though, does an homage constitute a cover swipe and I'm here, I have a problem here, and we're going to stop and we're going to reset.
I bet it's the same problem I have.
The term cover swipe implies that you're trying to steal something.
Yeah.
The term cover swipe implies theft of intellectual property created by someone else.
Yep. Swiping.
Right. So at what point does an homage start to cross over into that realm? And then at the same time, at what point does it constitute perhaps intellectual property infringement, which is a whole other problem, right? Like, Todd McFarlane doesn't actually own the intellectual property on ASM 300 on that cover. Marvel does. So at what point do these homages have to then enter into parody law in order to be legal? Do you have thoughts on this, Chris?
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say, so that wasn't the same thing, but it is related. I don't know why, but at some point it fell out of fashion to, when you're signing your cover art, to do after McFarlane, after so-and-so, after Frazetta, after whatever, right? That was a common thing that's what I thought you were going to mention, because that for me is a big sticking point. If you are going to homage a cover, that to me is the correct way to do it, because you're letting us know this is a appreciation of that original piece, not necessarily fully my own creation, even if it's all drawn by that person. As far as the IP law versus parody law thing, I think that's kind of, we talked about the exacting of the posing and that sort of thing when it comes to the Infinite Crisis 7 cover. That to me is parody. Like, let's say it's a bad example because they're both DC, but there was a Harley Quinn swipe of that, or homage to that recently, where it's Batman holding Harley Quinn, I think, or Harley Quinn holding Batman. I can't remember. There's another great one where it's Supergirl holding Supergirl, right? It's such an exacting composition that it's clearly based on the original cover, but it has different characters, and it's done for what reads as like a visual, almost comedic effect, or for a parody, right? Like it is taking that idea and it's recreating it. If you change it enough that it's almost starting to be its own thing, and it's not instantly visually recognizable, and you don't own the rights to the original, and you're not crediting the original artist, that to me starts to stack up to an area where you could be treading on some dangerous waters there.
Right. And I think I see in the comments some hard lines being taken by people who frequently take hard lines on things. And I really do think this is a very blurry line, right? Because at some point you enter into difference without distinction category on some of this, right? Because Weird Al, when he does a parody of a song, doesn't have to say, "This is my song, Gangster's Paradise," after the artist Coolio. He just does it, and you're expected to know. right? Like, and he may say that in the CD jacket or whatever, but you're just expected to know. And I think the same thing happens with art, right? Like when you see someone who's homaging the Mona Lisa, you're just expected to know that that's an homage to the Mona Lisa. When you see an homage to ASM 300, you're just expected to know, right? It sometimes people say, I remember Greg Land after such and such doing a cover that was a Craven's Last Hunt homage.
Mm-hmm.
Great, but that doesn't happen all the time, and nor should it have to. And while Weird Al does get permission, I see you, Big B, he doesn't necessarily tell you if you don't know. Right? You hear a song, and if you're not familiar with the song, you would have no idea that it was a parody.
Well,
right?
And also, infamously, he doesn't actually have to do that. That's been reported many times that he doesn't. He just does it because he thinks it's the polite thing to do, basically.
Right. So, what do you do if you want to parody Ed? Right. What do you want to do if you want to parody an artist who's dead?
Also, I believe it was Prince was the one person who actually said no to him, I want to say. Oh, was there two? Sting was the other one? Michael Jackson.
Coolio.
Oh, okay, that's right. Okay.
So he just went to, by the way, he just went to the guy that Coolio homaged and got permission from him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's become a real thing in music.
Is a Stevie Wonder song, which is actually something Stevie Wonder borrowed from somebody else. Like, anyway, but that's what I'm saying, is that's how this rabbit hole goes. Yeah. So at what point do you have to mention it? There isn't a clear definition here, no matter what CJ tries to tell you. Because if I do an homage to the Flash logo for the Experience, right? I don't have to say after the Flash logo. You're just expected to know. Right? Like, that's what we're talking about. So, it's something that we kind of need to define, right? In order to answer this question, what about him. But here's where I want to go, and we need to get to our next break. This is one of those things that it's really easy for us to come down on, right? It's really easy for us to say, oh, we're going to take the high road, and homage covers are bad. Right? Like, that's, I think, where for both of us this topic kind of started. In a level of, is this really good for the industry? Is this really good for creativity? Is it really good for comedy? Is this hack? Like, is this just, there are no new ideas, so why would we try? So let's just make a bunch of homages? Or is this something else? Is this really an appreciation for what came before? And I think the answer is more simple to find artist by artist rather than trying to paint everything with a big brush, right?
Yeah, even case by case, I would say beyond even just artist by artist, because for me, it's one of those things where the gradient of quality, not even quality, but quality plus intent can really make a huge difference in this one, because there's no doubt, like, whether it's legal or not is one important tentpole. I think we've kind of have an established system, more or less, though, to the point where I don't think there's probably going to be much change on that in the near future, most likely. However, I think another element to it is it okay or not? Is it too much? Is it too hacky? Is it, it's kind of like a prop comedian in stand-up comedy, to go back to Jerry Seinfeld. A lot of comedians don't like prop comics because they think they're hacky. But if the audience is laughing, if the customers are buying, in the case of comics, does it matter? Does it become a problem? I will say that I think the saturation has become problematic to me over the last few years, and that's kind of where I think we're going to go after our last break here.
Yeah, we're gonna take our last break here in just a second. But before we do, Big B McFly, the term homage implies that you were paying homage or respect to the artist that came before. But is the artist paying homage, or are the publishers?
Yeah.
Because if a publisher says, hey, I need you to create a cover that's an homage to this, then who's really paying the respect? And that's part of where this question gets a little iffy. And we're going to try to tackle that, plus the proliferation of this, all in the last 10 minutes of the show. As we come back from this very, very quick break, I want to remind you that tonight, about a half hour following the show, that guy and that guy, yes?
That guy.
Have a show over on that guy's channel where I will be in the comments while working on other things. So join them for that. And we will be right back after this very short break. Download our app on Google Play and the App Store. It's so simple, even my mommy can use it. Twitch, it's not just what happens when you have too many energy drinks anymore. Check out our content over there too.
Welcome back, everybody. So, CJ, I just want to say to you, sir, hopefully you're taking this idea and running with it. And after our show wraps up, or after the stream I do tonight with Big B, you jump on your live and you do a reacts to the Devil's Advocate stream. I think that would be a great use of your time, man.
Especially because I'm going to tell you, you can't set everyone straight. It's impossible.
Yeah, it's going to be a very hard thing to do.
You don't know what goes through every single person's mind.
Yep.
So, unfortunately, and this is the thing with some of the topics we've had recently that I think maybe needs addressed, is that we're talking about gray areas. We're not. It's not black and white. The world does not exist like that for much of anybody, especially in this world and especially in this industry.
Yeah.
So, because we don't necessarily know what's in a person's mind when they set out to do some of this work, we can't say, is this an homage or is this not an homage? Is this a parody? Is it not? Is this, satire versus parody versus mimicry versus homage versus a cover theft? And the fact of the matter is that anybody who tries is wasting their time, energy, and vocal cords. So you have to acknowledge that the world exists in this gray area. But what we can definitively sort of start to jump in is how it affects us as consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. And also always welcome opinions on the subject, as long as they're presented in a respectful manner, which, chat's doing. I'm just saying that's the beauty of it, is we all get to have opinions on this, and getting to talk about those opinions in the comic book community is extremely important, because it's how we reach, kind of a general consensus on some ideas or talk about important issues. And that kind of leads us into this last segment we're going to do, where it's this idea of my thesis here. My opinion is, I think there's too many homage covers being produced today. I think it's taking away from the general quality level of covers that could be done. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand, like I mentioned earlier, with a larger variant cover in general scheme. Because if you have an original cover for your A cover, which could be an homage itself, and you're going to do, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 homages or variants, how many of those are going to be homages? At least one, probably. That's just because that's an easy way to get an extra cover filled out. You don't have to think of a new idea. It's easy to tell an artist to, hey, here's what I'm looking for, right? And like I said, some of those are amazing. It's not a broad brush I'm trying to paint here, but that's my opinion. So what I want to say about that is I do wonder if it's stifling some artists' creativity a little bit to be constantly asked to do these pieces. And it's not always asked. Some of them do it on their own, and it's brought to the publisher, that kind of thing too. That happens too, of course. But often I think it's being asked to produce an easily marketable cover, because it is kind of like a cheat code in some ways. People will buy the nostalgia. We've seen that over and over again. But also, people will buy it. So this is where you kind of get to that duality for me of like, does it matter? Because if people are buying comics and supporting the industry and putting their money into it, it's obviously what they want to see. I think that's where you get to that, one of those wonderful gray areas that we can definitely discuss, and I'd love to see chat's opinions on that. Go ahead.
I will tell you right now, I don't think that there are enough, or that there are too many. I think there are probably enough. And here's what I mean. And this is real simple. It's super easy for people to come down on Dynamite, and I do it myself a lot, mainly because I know Nick knows I'm joking, because I know this fact. They wouldn't make as many covers for these books as they do if people weren't buying them. Right?
Yeah.
If people weren't buying them, they'd make less. Period. It doesn't make financial sense to make more than people are willing to buy. So when you start to think about homage covers, the second that there's one more than people are willing to buy, then it's over. Right? You have to start pulling back on the homage covers. You have to start adjusting the way you do homages, whatever. So because we know that they're incredibly popular, because if they weren't, again, they wouldn't make that many. I think there's probably enough. There's probably an homage for every different type of person, right? Whether it's an homage to a horror movie, or an homage to classic advertising, or an homage to other Disney projects, or the homage that I suggested to Nick for Dynamite last week, which is a, Hercules variant where Herc is holding Hera in that pose. And it's the crossover issue with their Hades series that they're doing. Like, now I've got not only a crossover event, which most people would tell you there are too many of, but now I've got a crossover event with a homage cover. Because guess what? I'll buy it. Because that would be cool. And so there are not too many. There's just enough. And maybe there are too many of certain homages, but not overall of the whole trend.
I definitely agree with parts of that. And I do want to add some context on my comments, because I will also tell you that I think it already has cooled down a little bit versus where it was at like in about 2021, 2022. I was seeing a lot more in solicitations that I'm seeing now for homage covers. So I think it has cooled down a little bit. And I think that's part of why this is something that I think there's too many of, is because I think you got to be a little careful not to go to the well too many times before it hits bottom and runs dry. So I think that there's something to be said for a little self-moderation. I wouldn't say like, I hope next month, I hope there's no homage covers. No, I think, but when I was seeing a title have 6 or 7 variant covers and 2 or 3 of them are homage covers regularly, it gets a little much. Like, the ratio's a little off. If you have 5 or 6 variant covers and one of them's an homage, for me, that's the right ratio. For the market, it might be something different. And also, there's another aspect of this that happens, which is you kind of hit it there, which is it might be the wrong covers being homage too much. That's one aspect. And also, the personal preference part is you're kind of splintering your audience of potential buyers to some extent, because if they don't like the original, if they don't like the new take on it, they're less likely to buy it if it's not for them, if it's too niche, if it's, overdone even. So that's where it's a balancing act. Now I think that's up to publishers for themselves to mostly decide. Like I don't, customers are going to help them make that decision on the buying side. But I do think that it's something that I see the trend kick up every once in a while, and it does make me worry about, man, it just along the lines of like, are we doing too many variant covers? Are we doing too many store exclusive covers? That kind of stuff. Convention exclusives, are there too many of them? This kind of goes hand in hand with that with me. And I think the answer is there's no easy answer. For me, I'd say there's too many. For the market, clearly it's still doing pretty well. So it's a balancing act. But I think for the overall health of the industry, my opinion is that if they held back the reins a little bit, it would probably be better for the long-term success of homage covers.
Well, and so I will say this, and it's a kind of an interesting thing from a retailer standpoint. You have a column A problem and a column B problem. Column A is that there are too many variants. It is too hard to order books because there are too many variants and you don't know exactly what people want, right? Then along that line, with there being too many variants, you have to jump through too many hoops to get certain variants.
Mm-hmm.
So I go back to when Marvel launched their legacy numbering. They did a group of lenticulars. Well, the Deadpool lenticular was an ASM 129 variant. You had to order basically 500 or 250% of your normal Deadpool order to qualify for it. Then once you did that, it was open order. You could order as many as you wanted. Well, most of the customers wanted that cover. So now you're actually ordering like 350% to 450% of your Deadpool order because you've got to order the 250% to qualify, then the 250% to actually sell through because that's what people are looking for. And now all of a sudden you're upside down on a book.
Yep.
So it's a little of column A, a little of column B. I think homage covers are great when you can just get them, right? When they're easy to obtain for a retailer. When they're behind some sort of gatekeeping, it's a whole other problem. And it creates a level of column A and column B, which then leads to, and this is what gets really dumb, I have to make a decision based on the amount of money in my bank if I'm willing to service you as a customer with the homage cover you want or the cover you want, right? It's no longer about providing you with the product you want. It's about, if I'm going to be upside down, what do I do here? Right?
Yeah.
And so now I could tell you, I'm not going to carry your book. And then you're going to be pissed at me as a retailer and not want to come back to my store. But you don't know the hoops I have to jump through to get to it or the amount of money that it's going to take out of my pocket. And so now you have retailers who are affecting the market of these things by just making simple, like, reasonable budgetary concerns, right? Reasonable budgetary decisions. So it's, now all of a sudden this homage that everybody wants is actually in hot demand because not enough retailers ordered it.
Yeah, that can happen too. The one thing we're kind of getting close to when we were going to end the show. So there's one other little point I want to make here at the end. This is my last kind of thought about it, which is, the cliche of won't anybody think of the children? Won't anybody think about the collector? And what I mean by that, it's kind of a weird one. And I totally understand if people don't agree with this, but it's something I've gotten comments about this before. There are people out there in the comic collecting world that they'll order every potential ASM 300 homage they see. And what'll happen to that person a lot, from what I've seen, from what they've told me, is a few years down the road, and whatever that might be, whenever hit their breaking point, they look at this collection of ASM 300 homages and it doesn't bring them joy anymore. It doesn't bring them, they've just felt the need to fill that collection, to keep going on that theme. And it's easy to say, well, that's their fault. They shouldn't have done that along the way. I get it. To me, it also does kind of go hand in hand with this idea of just why we talk about this stuff, though, is just be aware that that can happen. And I always recommend, like, when you're buying comic books, buy them because you want to support them, buy them because you love to read them, figure out a way to get rid of the ones you don't want later down the road. But also just think about, especially if you're hunting like back issues and stuff like that, do I really want to own this in 5 years? Do I really want to have to move this around from house to house every time I move or whatever? That's just kind of the last little parting part of it that I can think about. That is, again, it's kind of a first world problem, and I get that, but a lot of collectors have compulsivity problems. So part of the reason a lot of people do collect. So I think it's worth being mentioned, even though I know it's not necessarily the most glamorous thing to mention. But
Well, and I also want to mention real quick, like Big B says, the book has to be marked up to account for the requirements put in the way. But we just had a comment early in the show that said, well, if you mark them up, I'm not going to buy them, basically. Not going to pay more than cover. So, again, we go back to this double-edged sword on this kind of stuff. So, it turns into this, when we talk about this whole thing is very nebulous, there's a lot of gray area here. That's part of it. So, yeah, I'm kind of with Bronze here. Like, there's a level of you can only collect what you can collect, and you can only be into what you're into. But eventually you're going to say, man, I put in a lot of time and effort into something that really isn't important to me anymore. And what do I do from here? And if your collection is all of these worthless homage covers, and I say that knowing that they're not all worthless, but if they don't bring you joy, what value do they have other than what someone will pay you on eBay? Right? Like,
yeah,
then what are you left with? And so what's the deal with all these homage covers? I think the answer is there is no deal so long as you're collecting what it is you like.
yeah,
Yeah,
and I guess for me, it's just, I think that's a really common issue with cover collectors in general. And there's a portion of the audience that always scoffs at that, but let me tell you, there's a huge portion of collectors that are cover collectors, at least to some degree. Right. So, I mean, when it comes to what you want to read, when it comes to what you want to support, I think that's a much easier justification for people. Because, hey, you're great. You're reading the comics you love. You're supporting the market and the stores and the artists and the publishers you want to support. Fantastic. When it comes to just, like the filling that need to feel like you need to collect something, maybe just think twice about what it is you're getting out of that, and whether it's a momentary hit of dopamine or if it's a long-term valuable asset to you.
Right. The other thing, in ASM 129 said it on Insta. If you're someone who experiences things like obsessive compulsive disorder, or you have obsessive personality disorder, or compulsive personality disorder, or addictive personality disorder, or one of these things where the idea of not getting every homage cover or not getting every number one cover is like causing you anxiety, I get it. We all get it. That's one of those 988, or whatever you need to do. Talk to somebody if you're feeling anxious because I didn't get the 1 in 1, or the 1 in 100 cover. Talk to somebody because we get it. It can be really painful. It can be really hard. And I've seen people, I've had to deny sales to people who are like, I'm spending my last $12 on this comic book because I have to have it. And I'm like, how are you going to eat? And they're like, we'll figure that out tomorrow. No. Just, hey, if you're feeling that way, just make sure that you talk to somebody, get some input from somebody outside of your circle, and, acknowledge that it isn't the end of the world.
I wouldn't recommend this is a very general statement, along with what Kyle just said. If you're finding yourself putting your comic purchases on your credit card, not because you want to, because of points or because you're going to pay it off or security on the credit card, but because you feel like you have to be able to afford the comic, that's one of those times to maybe kind of step away. Just my personal advice there.
So, like I said, I know this is one that can really trigger some of that for people. The homages specifically. So
it hits that nostalgia, which is a tough one.
Yeah. So, all right. Bronze has another show in 23 minutes. If I want to be in the comments, I need to get my ass home. So, next week, Bronze and I get to know Baby Bronze and Baby Kyle as we discuss first fandoms in a new thing we're doing called Getting to Know the Devil's Advocates.
Just imagine me with less facial hair.
So, yeah, that's next week. Baby Bronze, Baby Kyle, first fandoms, getting to know us a little bit next week. I wanted to call it Why I Always Cry at Ghostbusters, but that's a whole other part of this. So, everybody, Bronze will see you in 22 minutes, 23 minutes, and with Bigby. And I will see everybody tomorrow at 7 for Minute to Skim It, where we have a ton of great books to read for our reviews. All of our show tomorrow here on The Experience, Bronze's show tonight over on the Bronze Age Nerd YouTube channel. And we will see everybody next week or tomorrow or whenever we see you. Please hit subscribe, hit like, come back again. If you're over on Instagram, not all of our shows are on Insta, so make sure you follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, Twitter, all those places. We will see everybody next time.
Join the party. Head over to our Linktree to find all the links for everywhere The Experience is all the time.